Good evening. I'm so pleased to be here with you all tonight. My name is Marci Reaven. I'm the Vice President of History Exhibits at New York Historical Society. So before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue our mission to make history matter. The museum is currently open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, so we welcome you to visit. And just please go on our website and reserve your timed entry tickets. So I'd also like to let you know that tonight's program will last about 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. So we've disabled the chat function, so please make sure to use Q&A for your questions. And then after the presentation, we'll get to as many questions as we can. So I'm really pleased tonight to have the chance to revisit our exhibit, World War II in New York City. It opened at New York Historical in 2012, and it was actually one of the first exhibits that I did on site in the museum, so it's always been a favorite. Our goal with the exhibit was to explore what New York City was like during World War II and how the people of our region contributed to the Allied victory. So tonight, I'm going to share some highlights from that story and introduce you to a few of the pretty incredible eyewitnesses who I was lucky to meet while we created the exhibit. So to do that, to make those introductions, we'll be playing for you 3 of the short films that we made for the exhibit. We worked with wonderful film director Vivian Ducat to make these. But speaking of eyewitnesses, I first want to acknowledge Arthur Grabiner, a World War II veteran who's watching tonight with his son, Doug. Mr. Grabiner served in the Navy aboard the USS Lawrence, an attack transport ship in the Pacific. He was born in the Lower East Side, raised in the Bronx, and still lives in the city. He turned 95 last week. So Mr. Grabiner, happy birthday and welcome. So New Yorkers from the very beginning were acutely aware. Actually, if you could go back to the previous slide, Oscar, that'd be great. Thank you. So New Yorkers were acutely aware of and engaged with the terrible events that were taking shape in Europe and Asia during the 1930s. This is in part because we all had close ties to one side or another. 3/4 of the city's residents were first or second generation immigrants. And many of the organizations headquartered here had a stake in the outcome of the political and military contest. These publishing and media concerns, international businesses, and civic, labor, political, and religious organizations had the influence to make their opinions count and the interest to continue to press for their views of what should happen. We can go to the next slide. Great. So the New School for Social Research was one of the groups that took decisive action. In 1933, right after the Nazi rise to power, the New School gave refuge to distinguished and threatened political and social scientists. They established the university in exile with Rockefeller funding, and that's the group that you're looking at right now. This was only one of the many efforts by New York-based civic and religious organizations to save European Jews and political opponents who were being targeted by the Nazis and the fascists. Shortly after Japan invaded China in 1937, Chinese Americans and friends of China rushed to aid the Chinese. This photo shows the first war relief drive in New York's Chinatown, which attracted 2,000 participants. A second one, 6 months later, drew 12,000. In both parades, women carried this huge nationalist Chinese flag into which bystanders could throw their coins and bills. Within 2 years, fundraising by the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association had raised $1.5 million to send to China to help the victims and supply the troops. During these same years, Nazis and fascists trolled for supporters in German and Italian neighborhoods, where national pride might aid their efforts. This photo captures a Nazi German-American Boon Parade on 86th Street, with marchers urging their fellow German Americans to join them. Most supporters of the Bund were first-generation immigrants or German nationals. That same year, the FBI estimated that the Boone's national membership was 75,000, with most members living in the 5 boroughs. There were also significant numbers of New Yorkers across the political spectrum who strongly advocated for staying clear, entirely clear, of these foreign entanglements. But the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, ended most public expressions of anti-war views. Shortly after the attack, actually, would you go back just one second? Thanks. Shortly after the attack, the US declared war on Japan, and then on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on us. Now you can change, thanks. The onset of war dramatically heightened the stakes for Americans. In summer 1942, as news of the Nazis' escalating genocide of European Jews became public, the Jewish Labor Committee, American Jewish Congress, and B'nai B'rith hosted a mass demonstration against Hitler atrocities at Madison Square Garden. The following spring, an even more insistent pressure group called the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe organized the We Will Never Die pageant with a script by Ben Hecht, the famous Ben Hecht, and score by Kurt Weill. Labor activist A. Philip Randolph also organized a rally at Madison Square Garden in 1942. This was part of the national campaign to counter racial discrimination in defense employment and the armed forces. The campaign had actually won, there you go, thanks. The campaign had actually won an important victory the year before when Randolph threatened to mount an enormous march on Washington, which had convinced FDR to issue the Executive Order 8802. This order, and has been a really important one for years, this order required defense factories to, quote, provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin. 18,000 people attended this Madison Square Garden event to hear music and speeches against Jim Crow. Randolph himself spoke, as did Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune of the National Youth Administration, Walter White of the NAACP, and New York City Councilman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Now you can change. So I'm actually proud to say that museums got involved in the war effort too. In 1942, the American Red Cross set up a surgical dressing workroom in 2 ground floor galleries of New York Historical Society. By the end of 1944, the all-female volunteers had rolled a staggering 4 million surgical sponges. Once completed, these 4 by 8-inch dressings would be boxed, shipped overseas, and sterilized for use in evacuation hospitals throughout the European warfront. Another museum that jumped in to help was the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Staff in the Arms and Armor Department designed head and body coverings for infantrymen and bomber crews. They drew on their knowledge of ancient and modern armor to help develop the standard M1 helmet that provided more protection and a snugger fit for soldiers of different sizes. Met armors like Leonard Heinrich, who you see here, continued to aid the Army throughout the war, including work on another prototype helmet that he's working on in this photo. You can change now, thanks. In 1940, President Roosevelt had called upon the US to become the arsenal of democracy. One of the most significant ways that New York and its metropolitan region contributed to the common cause was by producing immense quantities of war material and also needed goods of all kinds. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was perhaps the center of this. It was the largest shipbuilding facility in the country. At the height of production, the yard operated 24 hours a day, employing 75,000 men and women. For the first time, female workers could actually leave the flag sewing department where they had been stuck before and get higher paying yard jobs such as ship fitting and welding. So our first film to show you tonight is about the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and I think it'll give you a good sense for the yard's importance.
Brooklyn Navy Yard was a very, very important source of wartime employment for New Yorkers in general, but especially for African Americans, and employed thousands and thousands of people. And there were a few thousand African American men and women who ultimately got jobs at the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
It was unimaginable to work in a place like the Navy Yard. So you had immaculate lockers, you had wonderful washrooms, a real place to sit and enjoy your lunch. The Navy Yard was like no other. It was a city. It was a city within itself. It was like always something going on, night or day.
You see the guys on the ships coming in, going out. It was constant. Everybody's walking around, you're in and out of shops. It was very lively.
It never closed. It was, the lights were on. I did my 8 hours, you did your 8 hours, and he did his 8 hours. I took over your job on your machine because the Navy way is that everybody could do somebody else's job.
You go through a course of maybe 5, 6 weeks. That's how we learned how to do welding, on little scraps of metal. And then they bring us out into the shipyard, where all the men are lined up waiting for these women to walk in. Well, we walk in there and they start screaming at us, "Go back home. Go in the kitchen where you belong." So we ignored them. We just started to work on parts of the Missouri. And the proudness that you felt when that ship went out in that water, we all cried. We were just sobbing. You know, said, gee, we helped build that ship.
The government had provided an atmosphere that was conducive to getting the best out of you. I never saw anything like it before, and I've never seen anything like it since.
So the region produced not only ships, but just about anything that you could think of. I'm going to give just a few examples in the next couple of slides. Defense contracts fueled output at aviation factories like Republic, the image on your right. Republic was in Farmingdale, Long Island, but the Grumman was in the Long Island and other aviation factories. Republic made P-47 Thunderbolts, which the Army Air Forces flew as bomber escorts and ground attack fighters in the European, and Pacific theaters. And in 1943, and looking at the image to the left, Pfizer opened the world's first penicillin plant in a converted factory on Marci Avenue in Brooklyn. This plant produced 90% of the penicillin that the Allies carried ashore on D-Day. Next slide, please. Fashion designers also went to work creating uniforms for US troops. The American designer Mainbacher, also called Manbochet, created this uniform for the WAVES, the US Navy's female corps. And WAVE stands for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. And New York garment factories and garment workers produced huge quantities of the uniforms that were made for all the services. Looking at the image on your right, admin produced propaganda for the Office of War Information to educate the public about the policies, progress, and aims of the war. The OWI opened an office on West 57th Street to harness the city's media and advertising might. And they disseminated home front and war front messages, not only through posters like this one, but also through many other forms of media. So products made in our region and throughout the country then shipped out to Europe and the Mediterranean through our tremendous port. This gave the city an absolutely critical role to play in the Battle of the Atlantic. The supply lines that stretched from the Port of New York to Great Britain and Soviet Union sustained the Allied fight against the Axis. Leaders on both sides believed that whoever controlled Atlantic shipping stood the best chance of winning the war. Next slide. New York became, in effect, the rear echelon to the war front, responsible for supply and administrative operations for the major theaters of operation in Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean. Here you see WAVES and other Navy personnel working at the Eastern Sea Frontier headquarters at 90 Church Street, directing large convoys of merchant ships away from danger. They plotted the position of Liberty ships and tankers and all the other vessels which were going across the Atlantic, as well as known or suspected U-boat positions on giant wall charts. The charts also helped the Army Air Forces and Navy find and sink these German submarines. Merchant ship captains gathered at the port director's office in the Whitehall building at 17 Battery Place prior to each convoy departure. They collected their orders here in sealed envelopes and learned the latest intelligence regarding U-boat activity. So in 1944, the year of this photo, there were 439 convoys involving over 7,500 ships that left New York Harbor. Most of these were cargo ships, but troop transports also left from New York Harbor. The city was a major embarkation point for Europe and North Africa, involving 3,300,000 men by the end of the war. This was another of the huge roles that New York played. But before embarkation, the troops needed to be trained. So the country faced the daunting task of quickly preparing millions of Americans to fight and to serve in all the other capacities. New York played an important role in this as well. And basic and advanced training facilities opened up around the city and the region. And all of the services took advantage of the local talent, industry, and educational institutions in New York City, yet another of the city's critical roles. And I'm going to mention just two of these facilities. This is one, it's the Signal Corps. In 1942, the Army opened its Signal Corps Photographic Center in the former Paramount Studios in Astoria, Queens. Some of you may recognize the building. Today it's the Museum of the Moving Image and Kaufman Astoria Studios. So here during the war, and really until about 1968, the Signal Corps made films, and New York and Hollywood talent worked alongside enlisted men and officers, employing film and photographs to help win the war. Director John Huston, actor William Holden, writer William Saroyan, and many other famous names worked here, as did many newsreel and documentary makers. Combat photographers and cameramen trained here as well. So the second film I'd like to play is an excerpt, a smaller excerpt from a film we did with former combat cameraman Philip Schultz, who grew up in the Bronx.
It was the old Paramount Studios in Queens, and that's where they set up a photo school. I went in as a photographer, but one day they came in, we need motion picture cameramen. Who wants to be a cameraman? So I raised my hand, and that became my career. I was a combat cameraman with a rifle on my back and a pistol on my head, and I had to use them a couple of times, but I could never kill. So I made sure that I don't hit anyone. One time I'm crawling in the tank rut, and all of a sudden I hear, "You can't get pictures that way, soldier." And I look up and there's a general standing up. A little later on, I was taking pictures of him getting a battlefield medal because he got hit by being standing up instead of being in the tank rut like I was. I was in the middle of it. I really was in every major battle in Europe, from D-Day to the Rhine, crawled across France on my belly, into Germany. I was in on the liberation of Paris, which was a great day. Vive la France.
So that was the Signal Corps, one of my favorite stories in the exhibit. The other facility that I wanted to talk about is another wonderful training center, was the USS Hunter. So from 1943 to 1945, over 80,000 Navy waves did their boot camp training on the Bronx campus of Hunter College, now Lehman College. The Navy commissioned the college the U.S. Naval Training Center, the Bronx, or the USS Hunter for short. In Navy speak, when waves entered campus, they came aboard. They walked upstairs to upper decks, and they went ashore to New York City. The waves constituted a formal branch of the military, not a women's auxiliary. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and other prominent women pressed for this distinction. Waves received military ranks and benefits and were paid the same as Navy men. So a popular recruiting poster used the allure of the big city to attract volunteers. A regiment of 2,000 new recruits arrived every 2 weeks at the USS Hunter. Waves received 6 weeks of basic training and then traveled to postings around the country for more specialized instruction. They replaced sailors in shoreside jobs. They trained pilots, rigged parachutes, staffed typing pools, decoded enemy communications, plotted ship convoy routes, as we've seen, and did much, much more. Well, yet another role that New York played during the war was the biggest entertainment and destination center for all the servicemen who were in the city. So New York became a big and much appreciated party town. Some GIs visited when they were on leave or when they were en route to training camps. And for others, New York was their last stop before embarking overseas. Central Park could offer many delights, including a place to relax, as these two sailors are doing. But also every Wednesday night, there were starlight dances that were held at the Heckscher Playground. And institutions around the city, like our neighbor, the American Museum of Natural History, went out of their way to welcome those in uniform by offering free admission. So to conclude, I'd like to show you a film about the very famous stage door canteen. The American Theater Wing created the canteen in 1942 in a space located underneath the 44th Street Theater. As you can see the stairs here going above the stage door canteen. The canteen was open 7 nights a week and all soldiers and sailors were welcome. So let's take a look at the film we made about this.
At New York Stage Door Canteen, men on leave rub shoulders with notables as they enjoy good food and amusing company.
The Stage Door Canteen was a big operation that the theater industry ran with the Red Cross that was designed to provide an entertainment venue for soldiers where no alcohol was served, but where soldiers could meet the biggest stars of Broadway.
You're Catherine Cornell, aren't you?
Yes, how'd you know?
Well, our dramatic coach at school has your picture.
Alfred Lunt, Lynn Fontanne, and Katharine Hepburn, Guy Lombardo, and Ray Bolger. He was a wonderful dancer and comic. The big stars worked behind the counters, and they made hot dogs and hamburgers. I volunteered with a bunch of my other friends.
Are you one of the hostesses? I don't know how to start. I've got kind of a sinking feeling.
Well, if you're going to sink, miss, you might pick this chair right here.
We were given little red, white, and blue aprons. You sat at tables and talked to the boys. Sometimes they'd never been to New York before. Sometimes they were 17 and going on a ship the next morning and they couldn't talk about it.
The Stage Door Canteen was a place where Black soldiers were welcome. It was one of the few venues outside of Harlem that I think Black soldiers would attend and feel like there was no problem there.
I can remember dancing with a black man for the first time in my life, and nobody did or said a thing about it.
The young women who volunteered there were told that they had to dance with and socialize with the people who were there, regardless of their race. There was no indication that this was a place that was segregated, even though most of New York remained socially segregated.
You danced with the boys, not officers. It was only the regular soldiers and sailors and Marines. And they wanted dates afterwards, and we weren't allowed. I imagine some girls allowed themselves to have dates, but we weren't supposed to.
My feet's beat. Beat right down on my socks. I'm soaking wet.
That sailor I was with danced like he was seasick. And my last pair of nylons.
Gee, I wish this war was over.
All we did was dance and chat with the boys. We had a good time.
So I love those films, and actually you can still see many of them on the NYHS website, and at the end of the program we'll put up the URL for the website page that you can go to see more of those films. So actually we got a nice note from Arthur Grabiner, Mr. Grabiner, who I mentioned earlier, was the Navy vet who's joined us tonight. So I'm just going to read you these notes from him. He said, I believe that the keels for the USS Arizona and USS Missouri were laid at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. When I returned home to New York City from the Pacific after Allied victory, I was at the Brooklyn Navy Yard for 1 week before being discharged. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that happened. Every Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, I attend a commemoration at Republic Airport, former site of the Republic plane builders. It's great. Thank you for letting us know that. Okay, so we have a question. Let's see. My grandfather was a Lutheran pastor in Westchester in the 1930s and 40s, where he used to hold services in German, but he stopped after the US entered the war. Was there a similar phenomena across the New York City neighborhoods with German immigrant populations? You know, I don't know whether that's the case. I can surmise that it could have been the case. Certainly during World War I, there was reluctance, there was pressure for people to stop, German speakers to stop speaking German. And there was a reluctance among some to identify themselves as German. So I think that is possible. It's an interesting question. Some Germans, German and Italian and Japanese New Yorkers who were not citizens were from time to time visited by the authorities, and especially if they believed that there had been suspicious information. Some were detained. There was nothing like the across-the-board detention of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. But some were detained, and Ellis Island was actually one of the major detention centers for the East Coast during the war. Another question is, how did the wartime munitions and armament industry have long-term impacts on the environment? Pollution in the rivers, canals, bays. Wow, what a question. I'm sure there are people who could answer that in some depth. Clearly there was an impact, and I'm sure, I mean, right now we're dredging the Gowanus Canal, for example. Now this wasn't the only damage being done to the Gowanus Canal. That had been going on for some time, but I'm sure that the war did have an environmental impact. The one thing I'm sure of is that it had an impact on the Hudson. We recently did a show on environmental history of the Hudson River. And I remember reading that the incredible industrial activity up and down the Hudson River Valley during the war, and the amount of shipping that was going up and down did have a big impact. Already the river was being polluted in the 1930s. There had been a lot of discussion about it, but after World War II, the level of pollution increased dramatically, and then it increased even dramatically again because of all of the new chemical and plastics industries that were sited along the river. So my guess is that if that hasn't been written about, that would be a really great area of research for someone to take on. Nice questions, you all. This is great. Let's see, here's another question. Los Angeles saw an incredible influx of artistic emigres who were fleeing Hitler and ended up in the film industry. Did New York City have a similar experience of writers, composers, musicians, artists, etc., who came here and made a lasting mark on the culture of the city? The answer is absolutely yes. I think the name immediately that comes to mind is Mark Rothko, but there were many others. During the slideshow, I just showed that one slide about the university in exile being founded by the New School for Social Research. Now they focused primarily on social scientists and people in the humanities, but there were many people out there, many people, very brave souls, arranging for the escape and refuge for targeted people, again, Jews, homosexuals, political opponents from the Nazi and fascist areas. And artists and all of the artistic people that you mentioned in this question were among the people who were being saved. In the crowded confines of the city, were families able to plant and tend victory gardens? Yes, and in the exhibit, we had pictures of victory gardens. There were victory gardens literally all over the city. Probably there were more in places like Brooklyn or Queens where there was more land that could be tilled, but there were victory gardens everywhere, and they were an important source of food. Because food was rationed and food was being saved as well for the people in the armed services. So there were victory gardens throughout the city. Next question. My father could not be an officer in the US Navy because he was not born in the US or in the British Commonwealth. He became a 90-day wonder in the Army instead and was commissioned as a lieutenant. Did the WWII have a similar policy? That is an interesting question that I don't know. If you'd like to, I'm sure that that is something that wouldn't be too hard to find out. There are big collections of WWII material at Lehman College in the Bronx, and also at the Schlesinger Library in Harvard, at Harvard University. And it could be that there's information in the finding aids for those collections, but also there have been books written about the WWII, and you might be able to find an answer there. Next question. Is there any commemorative plaque or marker to the USS Hunter and the WWII on the Lehman College campus? And did the New School actually sponsor those Jewish intellectuals? Now that I should know the answer to the first question about the commemorative plaque, because I actually visited the campus a number of times while we were doing this show, but admittedly that was 10 years ago, and so I'm not actually remembering. I do believe that there is. I feel fairly sure that there is, but I'm not 100% sure. But I know that the campus is extremely proud, that the university is extremely proud of that history. They were really cooperative with us in our effort to secure materials, and a number of the images, we did a whole section on the WWII in the exhibit, and a number of the images came from the Lehman College campus. So I would imagine there probably is some kind of commemorative plaque, but it would be easy to find out. The new school, I'm no longer remembering the specific history of the creation of the university in exile, but that is, so yes, the new school played a huge part in setting that up and bringing those individuals over. And I believe it was a very hands-on part. I don't think it was just setting up the administrative end of the university and saying, come join us once you get here. But I can't actually give you the specific history. But again, one that's definitely been written about and would be easy to, or relatively easy to find out. What kind of black market activity was happening in New York City during the war? Were they a result of food rationing or other reasons? Yes, there was a lot of black market activity. You know, the mob was part of that. I'm trying to remember now the stories. The historian Mike Wallace was one of the historians who shared a lot of his work with us. He's working on a history of this period. And Ken Jackson, also the great historian and our trustee, also wrote about black market activity. Yes, there was rationing for everything. So of course, when there's rationing and limited sources and people want to try to make things easier for themselves, they're gonna find a way to try to get that. And so there were plenty of people looking for black market goods because this wasn't just oil, this wasn't just food, but it was also gas. So, you know, you needed gas to drive your car. It was rubber, it was, you know, things made of rubber, things made of any kind of material that could be used in war production. Again, the United States was the only country in the developed world that wasn't at war. And so we had a critical role to play in production. And so much of the materials for production were going into war production, making shortages in other areas. So that was the black market activity. And there was a add-on or a question in addition, can you speak about the big gay community in the Brooklyn Navy Yard? Not specifically, I can't. In the Brooklyn Navy Yard, you may well be right that was the case. We did have a number of segments in the show about gay New Yorkers during the war, both about serving soldiers and what that was like for them, as well as about people in the entertainment industry, as well as the, you know, the drag shows that were playing all over the world as men had to entertain themselves, as the Army helped them by sending out sets and costumes and all other kinds of material. And those performances, the drag performances, often involved gay men, and it gave them, as one of our historians told us, it gave them a way to kind of express themselves during the war. But I actually don't know anything about the gay community in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Herstory Archives is one place that you might be able to find information. They're in Brooklyn, as well as other libraries and organizations devoted to those issues. Were there ever any pro or anti-war demonstrations in New York City? It's hard to imagine anything like the Civil War draft riots, but did anything? There were lots of pro or anti-war demonstrations in New York before Pearl Harbor Day. I don't want to say that nothing, and after Pearl Harbor Day, there were many pro-war demonstrations. One called March for America, I think, took place in about June 1942. There were literally 500,000 participants in the parade. So it took 11 hours for the parade to go from start to finish. in front of millions of participants. Everybody marched. In terms of anti-war, and that was just one, but in terms of anti-war marches, my general understanding is that no, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were not public expressions of anti-war belief, but that is not to say that there weren't some, especially smaller ones. Another question, and again, these are just wonderful questions. Do we know whether the racial and gender integration at the Brooklyn shipyard continued immediately after the war, and whether it spread to other commercial enterprises in New York City? It's a great question. In terms of gender, as many of you may know, the openness that the US government and many private employers had to women during the war did not continue after the war. And so there was a general move to push women out of the workforce, send them back home, as if women hadn't been working all along, but the idea was to send them back home and make jobs for all of the men who were coming home from the service. So I find it hard to imagine that gender integration would have continued in the same way at the Brooklyn Navy Yard because the jobs just weren't available. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't better gender integration than there had been before the war. There's a wonderful museum, if you haven't been there, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, about the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I'm sure it's probably not open now, but hopefully it will be after the pandemic is over. And if you haven't visited, that is a wonderful source for Brooklyn Navy Yard information. In terms of racial integration, I don't know. I do know that New York took the lead, and I'm just not going to now forget the state law that I'm thinking about, but New York was under Democratic leadership at the time and had a relatively far-reaching and progressive idea about racial integration in industry. And so there were state laws in terms of fair employment and fair housing that may not have been enforced well all the time, but at least were on the books, which was more progressive than in many other states. But I'm not sure about the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But again, I think that would be an answer that could be obtained at that Brooklyn Navy Yard Museum. Another good question about whether there were public health concerns that came up during the war. Very relevant to today. I am trying to think about whether I can remember any. There was, lots of concern about civil defense. The Nazis never did develop a bomber that could reach the United States, but of course, at the time, nobody knew that. So there had been a lot of concern, and there was a lot of civil defense activity. But I'm just actually not remembering anything about a major public health scare. So it looks like we're about to end. The only thing I'd like to add is just to make a point about how many people, how many organizations throughout New York helped us with this show. So there are just tremendous visual archives and audio archives throughout the city. The Brooklyn Historical Society is one of them. So if you're interested in this material, I recommend you visit them when possible. The New York Public Library is another, but there were just so many private collectors and institutional collectors who made it possible to do the kind of show we were able to do. So we have one more note from Arthur. Let's see. Arthur Grabiner, he said, on December 7th, 1941, 4 days before my 16th birthday, I was sitting in my bedroom on Longfellow Avenue in the Bronx, listening to the WOR radio broadcast of the New York Giants versus Brooklyn Dodgers NFL football game from the Polo Grounds. Suddenly, the broadcast was interrupted with news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That's the kind of memory that most of us do not have. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to close for tonight. Again, Mr. Grabiner and Doug and everybody who's been here with us tonight, thank you for joining us. So we wanted to let you know that our Curator confidential programs are taking a break for the holidays, but look out for emails about upcoming programs for 2021. Again, thank you. Happy holidays to everybody and good evening.